of their fertility, and of course, turn on that light on their fertility journey. Hopefully by the end of this talk today, you will feel like the light has been turned on. You know, and as always, I'd love to make this as interactive as possible. Today, we're talking about, as always, a huge topic, which we actually did try to talk about recently, but the talk somehow didn't get recorded properly, and so here we are once more. And today we're talking about MTHFR, the impact that it has on infertility, and of course miscarriage and everything in between. Welcome, I'm Gabriela Rosa. I'm a fertility specialist. I'm also a Harvard University awarded scholar. And for the last 2 decades, I have helped couples overcome infertility and miscarriage, even when other treatments have failed. We have now led over 100,000 people in more than 100 countries through our educational programs, basically our programs in general. And it is such a privilege, you know, to have been able to gather some knowledge and information that I know can help many more people around the world, you included. So welcome, huge welcome. Congratulations for being here. I think that it's important to acknowledge, you know, when there are challenges and there are difficulties on someone's journey, particularly, you know, many of the patients who we see in our clinic, they have not only been trying to conceive for a very long time, but have also gone through many failed treatments. And it almost feels like, you know, this situation of going around in circles, and that can be not only tiresome, I mean, tiresome to say the least, right? But it can be really challenging to continue to get up each time and try something new. And I am a firm believer that education is key in understanding what else you can do to optimize your chances and optimize your fertility. And that's why I devote so much of my time to educating around the topics that couples need to understand. So welcome, huge welcome. It is such a privilege, you know, to be able to take you guys through this. Say hi. As always, I love to know where you're listening from, where you're watching from. It's always so wonderful to be able to connect. And I'm going to be answering as many questions as I possibly can in the time that we have in the next 50 minutes or so. I will say up front that, like every topic that we talk about in Ask Gabriela Rosa Live, this is a huge one. And this is even, I think, to a certain extent, this is almost like a bigger topic, because it really we have to kind of dive into a little bit of genetics, you know, genetics 101. Given my background, I've got a master's in reproductive medicine and human genetics. And so my background is really understanding those pieces and how they actually, you know, kind of fit together to help couples in the situation that I've described before. But I acknowledge that genetics can sometimes be a little bit like, oh gosh, what does it all mean? So we are definitely going to get started with a little bit of a genetics 101 lesson, because I think that's a really good place for us to begin, and also just kind of give a little bit of context. So hello, Rachel Gorgeous. Hi, Sarah. Sahar, Katie, lots of wonderful people on Instagram. We've got Becca and Wiz, and gosh, you know, you guys are awesome. I love that you not only show up, you keep showing up, and you keep learning and you keep growing. So that is super, super awesome. So let's get started then with our little genetics 101, shall we? The thing that we need to understand, the human DNA is a mystery still to this day, believe it or not. You know, what's fascinating about genetics and the research around genetics, and particularly the research around personalized medicine in genetics, nutrigenomics, and, you know, you name it. There's lots of different kind of pieces and initiatives in terms of research that are going on around the world. And yet what's fascinating is that it's all very much still in its very early stages, you know, and it's exciting. It's great, because at least now we know more about what we don't know, right? And you guys who have heard me speak before, you know that that's a big place that I like to explore. It's kind of like the place where it's the unknown, where we need to kind of keep asking questions about, because the more that we do, the more that we start to understand. Lots of times when couples come to me and they say the words, I have tried everything and nothing has worked, what they're really saying is that they've hit a ceiling in their level of knowledge and in their level of understanding. You know, they've hit a ceiling where all the things that they knew they could do, they could try, they could put in place, they've already done. And it hasn't quite given them the result that they wanted. And also it has kind of gotten them to a place where there's almost a level of hopelessness that can go along with that in hitting that ceiling, because it's like, gosh, you know, as far as I know, I've tried everything that I possibly could try and nothing has worked. What else is there, right? So let me know, actually, because I'd love to know, for those of you who are listening in, who feels like they've kind of got, you know, to that place at some point. And it would be wonderful, of course, if, you know, by finding this and, you know, all of the things that we do in terms of education, that you're starting to see that there is definitely more that you can be exploring. But, you know, many times people really do feel like they've kind of come to a place, they don't know anything else to try, and they feel like, oh gosh, you know, this is hopeless. I'm never going to have a baby. So ideally, and certainly through the work that I do, I want to make sure that you understand that, yes, there is always more that you can do. Guidance is essential, because if we don't, you know, have that ability to jump outside of that box, right, and that kind of ceiling that we have somehow, it's the glass ceiling that happens in so many areas of life, right? It can be difficult, but really it's about getting that clarity. So here's where we begin. The human genome, as I said, it is a mystery and it is wonderful, and it actually expresses and does all of the things that we're here to do in this world. There are 23 pairs of chromosomes, right, in basically each cell, and half from each parent. So there's a total, these numbers kind of boggle my mind. There's like a total of 50,000, approximately 50,000 genes in the human body. There's some 3 billion DNA base pairs or building blocks within those cells, within the body, and how they're arranged together is what gives us our genetic traits, okay? So ultimately, those variations, they happen in a sequence that's predictable. However, there are times and instances where there are exceptions to the rule. Isn't that life, right? There are exceptions to the rule, and those exceptions that basically they combine with things that happen in environment, biochemistry, and sometimes it's almost like a chicken and egg type situation, you know, like a gene expression or its expression in a certain way causes a certain biochemical pattern, but a certain biochemical pattern can also trigger genes to work in a certain way. So it's almost kind of like what happened first, right? But that expression, the different types of the combinations of those base pairs, is essentially what ends up giving us the traits, the physical traits, the biochemical traits, the way in which the body operates, and it governs basically populations around the world as well. So these variations or these variances, and I don't like to talk about mutations, right? You probably will hear me, I will avoid that word. If I do say it, I apologize in advance, because I just don't feel like, you know, we're not mutants. You know, MTHFR mutation sounds like, oh gosh, you know, like what's wrong with you? Whereas, you know, sometimes these SNPs, these nucleotide variations happen and they just produce a different result, okay? So what a SNP is a variance. It's kind of like this mutation that we don't talk about. But, you know, that is what essentially a SNP is. A SNP stands for single nucleotide polymorphism, okay? And each SNP within the DNA is basically a different kind of building block that has been kind of stuck into that nucleotide. So the way that you know, that base pair kind of operates is that you have a sugar. So in this case, it's called deoxyribose. Then you have 1 of 4 base pairs, and the different base pairs can be, you know, cytosine, thymine, adenine, guanine. So those are the 4 different types of base pairs, and that's kind of stuck with a phosphate. So that basically creates that base pair that then gets structured in a certain way. Okay, so a SNP or an error or a random variation within the DNA is essentially where instead of cytosine, being put into that base pair as the next sequence. It might be replaced with adenine or thymine or, one of the other ones, guanine or adenine. So basically it's about looking at, okay, what has happened within that base pair and why is that variation occurring? That variation may be occurring in different places, and that also will dictate what type of change or pattern of change biochemistry exhibits, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But really, these variations occur throughout the DNA. And on the average, there's like 1 in 1,000 variations within the nucleotides. So roughly in our entire body, there's like 4 to 5 million different SNPs or variations in the person's genome. So you can see it's a huge, these numbers kind of get, scale and get really, really large. And what's fascinating is that there's about, that we know of so far, and this is what I talk about in terms of the things that we don't know. We know there's around about 100 million SNPs or variations within different genes in populations around the world. So you can see the scale of this becomes, crazy, becomes almost unfathomable. And so it's about looking at all of these things. Most commonly, these variations are found in between the DNA. And so that doesn't really kind of make a real difference to the way in which our genes express and how our body expresses all of those. They're kind of called almost biological markers, within the process. They also have very little effect on development or function. Right? But when those variations, when those SNPs happen within the gene or the regulatory aspects or regions of the gene, they then begin to play much more of a direct role in disease and, of course, gene function, right? And when that happens, we then start to question, okay, what is it that we need to do here in order to ensure that we remove or reduce the obstacles to proper function? And that's where MTHFR kind of falls, into that place, because there is definitely a change in the gene or the regulatory areas within the gene that causes this to happen, these changes and these variations in function to happen. But here's one very important thing, and this is part of, the big ideas that I'm going to be sharing with you today, is that the gene, ultimately, there's a saying in genetics where we say that the gene loads the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger, right? And here's what I mean. Let's say, for example, that there is a genetic predisposition to alcoholism, okay? So, and there are, now we know that there are genes that are related to alcoholism. There are genes that basically make people more or less predisposed to becoming an alcoholic. Now, in the absence of alcohol or alcohol consumption, despite the fact that you have that predisposition, it's not really going to be triggered, right? Because you're not actually engaging in the function which makes it be triggered. Is this making sense? Let me know, because I'd love to kind of, get any, the feed is lagging. Okay, well, I've just heard on Facebook that the feed is lagging. See, there's something about this talk. This happened last time as well. But I hope that you guys are still able to kind of, get the gist. In fact, let's just do a little bit of a, give me on the comments below, give me some love, give me some likes. Let me know in the comments if you guys can actually see me, hear me, if you're kind of still getting the message despite the lag. And Instagram, guys, please let me know the same thing, because it will be good for me to be able to know if I'm still being understood. That is definitely always. So Gina said hello. So Gina, okay, so cool. I'm getting some interaction on Facebook to tell me, I hope that this is working out. Okay, just let me know in the comments. For those of you who are listening in, just let me know, yep, working, or, that would be really helpful. Fantastic. It looks like, okay, so Sandra just said, all good. Okay, good. Woo! I thought that, again, we were, being hijacked on the MTHFR talk. So anyway, so is this making sense in terms of, the genetic predisposition? So the genetic predisposition does not mean that you will develop a particular condition. There are some aspects to this that basically relate to the environment and the environmental triggers, okay? So we need to take that into consideration. Now, there are many different types of SNPs, and the effects vary greatly in terms of what it is that's going to happen or not happen as a result of, you know, a particular variation. So some SNPs might affect, for example, how someone responds to a drug, or it might affect the risk of developing a particular condition or a health disease, or be impacting on the susceptibility of an environmental trigger. For example, you know, like with the example of alcohol. Or it might be that a SNP can be used to track disease inheritance, so that we can understand, you know, is this person predisposed to this particular condition as a result of familial lineage, right? And of course, as I said before, there are so many different, you know, what's wonderful about this world and what's wonderful about, you know, the times in which we live, with the amount of technology and, you know, computing power that we have, is that we're now able to understand things that 50 years ago, gosh, we would take an entire lifetime to understand in a matter of weeks or months. And so there is always constant research. So this is by no means a topic that is static. We know, in fact, much more about it today. When I first started doing this 20 years ago, literally, MTHFR wasn't even a word. You know, it wasn't even a conversation in the fertility world, because, and people were like, not only you couldn't even screen for it, certainly we didn't even know what to do to test it, or, I mean, we couldn't screen, so we couldn't test, but we didn't even know what we would do if we found the results. In fact, I remember talking to my mentor about 10 years into my career, and we started to kind of hear about the possibility of this, you know, genetic mutation, right? Because by that point, we were talking about, instead of talking about variants, we're talking about mutations. This genetic mutation that predisposed people to have miscarriage. And at the time, we didn't even realize that this was actually related also to fertility and the ability to conceive and take a healthy pregnancy to term. We thought that it was just related to miscarriage. And the pathway in which it actually affected was very different to what we now understand. So, you know, all of these different aspects, they change with time. They change with more information that we have, with becoming more aware of the impact of all of this. So, you know, I'm sure that if I was to give this talk again in a year from now, there would be lots of change in the field of genetic research around this particular gene or SNP. But really quite an important thing to acknowledge, and this is going to be part of my big three ideas, is that if you think it is all about MTHFR, you have missed the point, right? Because remember, as I said, 10, 15 years ago, many people, I mean, if we think about how prominent, how prevalent the genetic variants of MTHFR SNP variants is, so like half the population, half of the world population has a change in this particular gene. And yet, lots of people still conceived and took home healthy babies irrespective of addressing that particular gene or the issues that arose as a result of that gene being variant, right? And so we need to take all of that into consideration and understand that we're not just dealing with one particular thing. Although, yes, it is important to address this, I feel that sometimes there's too much emphasis that is placed on this one thing. Right, the way in which we treat, and the reason that, you know, in the Natural Fertility Breakthrough Program, we have a 78.15% success, live birth success rate for patients who have previously tried everything and nothing has worked, is precisely because we don't keep, you know, these very narrow conversations narrow for long. We go through and we understand that, yes, this is an important area. This is something that we need to address, but what are the other 100 things that we might need to address at the same time, right? And that is something that is a very important key aspect to take away from this lesson today. If you take nothing else, just know that it is not all about MTHFR. Right? As much as, you know, there are people out there who specialize and only talk about that, and they sell supplements to address it and everything else. And I have no problems with any of that, right? If you've been following me for a little while, you will know that I am not pro self-prescription. I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think that you should read an article, watch a video and go and buy that supplement, because that always has to be part of a grand, broader plan and strategy. But at the same time, I think the education is valid. It's just that we can't narrow it down just to one point, right? So what is the MTHFR gene? Well, MTHFR, it provides the instructions for making an enzyme called methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase. Okay, and yes, it is a mouthful, and so from here on, we're going to just refer to it as MTHFR, right? And the enzyme, what it does is it actually plays a role in changing amino acids or processing amino acids. Really specifically here, we're looking at changing homocysteine into methionine. Okay, and if you had a chance to have a look at the screening or diagnostic talk that I did recently, I will have talked about this whole idea of how we test and how it's important to basically test and understand and take certain results back so that we can understand much more about what else could be going on. And often, you know, homocysteine is one that we will test and it will be elevated. And even if we haven't had the opportunity to test MTHFR, for example, in some countries around the world, it's very difficult to get this kind of testing. And because we treat patients all over the world, we know this. So sometimes, depending on the country that we're working with, we will test homocysteine first to be able to see, okay, is it elevated? Because typically in MTHFR variants, homocysteine will be elevated. Because this enzyme is not working, we're not actually transferring homocysteine into methionine, which is an antioxidant that's very important for fertility. And therefore, what ends up happening is that we end up with an elevation in the blood of homocysteine. So, but again, we'll talk more about this in a moment. The key thing here to understand is that this enzyme, the MTHFR enzyme, it's meant to really help us to process not only certain types of B vitamins, particularly folate, and to be able to what's called methylate them so that they're put into a useful form. But we also need to take into consideration the fact that every cell in the body is 50% fat, 50% protein. So you can imagine that even though, you know, we're dealing with an issue here that takes the inability of, you know, or reduces the ability to methylate, and we'll talk about what methylation is in a moment as well. But if we reduce that ability, we think that, okay, the problem here is that just that issue is in place. Well, actually, it's not all that it impacts, because methylation will also, like the inability to methylate, will also negatively impact the way in which you utilize your other nutrients, in whether you are actually absorbing them and being able to actually have the function within the system work in the way that it needs to work. So these are very important things to take into consideration. MTHFR is a very important chemical, you know, a chemical enzyme for a chemical reaction that changes those different forms of B vitamins, but it's not all that it does, right? So when it comes to the type of supplement, and this is something that I get asked all the time, so I'm just going to go ahead and answer some of that literally right now, because often, you know, I, in fact, had this conversation yesterday with a patient where she was asking me, I got an MTHFR variance and my doctor has just put me on really high dose folic acid. But I was reading that that's not necessarily the best thing to do. What's the truth, right? The reality of it is that if you have an MTHFR variance, you are not going to be able to utilize folic acid in that form. It can be quite toxic. It can start by accumulating, and it can be quite toxic because the body can't actually process it into the form that it needs to. So really what the body needs to do here is it needs to convert a type of folate, which is 5,10-methylene tetrahydrofolate. See, these words are all very big mouthfuls, into 5-methyl tetrafolate. So often what you will find is that when you go and buy a supplement that is methylated, it will already be in that 5-methyl tetrafolate form, right, which is the methylated form. However, again, we're dealing with the fact that that is not the only thing in that biochemical chain reaction, right, is that really what we're wanting to do is that we're wanting to utilize that nutrient in a better way so that we can actually then make homocysteine be transferred and, you know, transformed into methionine, sorry. And so basically those things are going to be very important to take into consideration in the grand scheme of things, because remember, methionine is really going to help us not only to detoxify, but also as an antioxidant. So it becomes incredibly important, not just to egg quality, but it also becomes extremely important to sperm quality. Okay, and we'll talk about in a moment how MTHFR mutation actually impacts both prospective parents. So let's get into some of these big ideas. And I can see that, okay, great. It looks to me like everything is working out fine on Facebook and fine on Instagram as well. So thank you for letting me know that. But let's get started with our big ideas. I'm going to be sharing 3 big ideas as I like to do, because I like to encompass the answers to as many questions as I normally get, you know, from you guys into some kind of really useful chunks so that you can take that away and start to implement it. One of the big problems with MTHFR isn't that you don't process your B vitamins and your amino acids correctly, right? And even though we were talking about that and the fact that this is essentially what's happening, the real problem is that methylation issue that we were talking about, right? And the incorrect processing that leads to the problem of methylation and poor methylation in general is really the big problem here. Because biochemically, you know, what methylation is biochemically is really where you have a methyl group that is added to a DNA so that it can function properly. But it really does mean that if we don't have that addition and if we don't have that ability to, you know, use those two things in a way in which the body can actually understand, respond, and utilize effectively, we end up with an regulation imbalance in the genetic expression. And so that translates to the body not functioning in the way that it would normally function, physically, biochemically, mentally, emotionally, in every way. You know, sometimes people with MTHFR mutation, they will report that they have a high incidence of depression, for example, or anxiety, or, you know, there are obviously the physical aspects in which the body detoxification becomes problematic. So bioaccumulation of heavy metals can be a real problem. You know, and methylation is a really essential part of what the body does in order to ensure that the nervous system works well, that the cardiovascular system works well, but also that the immune system works well. And what we know in terms of those areas or those parts of the body not working well is that they all have a direct or indirect link to fertility and reproduction. Because think about it, right? Reproduction, even though, you know, through standard therapy, normally we just really focus on the egg and the sperm. Those cells, they don't just kind of appear out of nowhere, right? They are a result of a biochemical chain reaction. That's why I always talk about the fact that, you know, fertility is a biochemical chain reaction. What you're experiencing right here, right, in terms of the body giving you a specific result, i.e., a miscarriage or an inability to conceive, really has arisen out of many multiple and sometimes hundreds, thousands of steps and even million biochemical steps that have happened up here somewhere, right? And so what happens is that in order to be able to bridge the gap of those biochemical chain reactions and how they perhaps need to be working that they're not, is where we need to start looking at, okay, what are all the things that we can do to simplify that process? You know, energy production is a very big part of, well, methylation plays a huge role in energy production. Now, we would think about energy production and go, okay, but I feel like I have enough energy. Yes, that's great, but what about the mitochondria within the egg and the sperm, which are the cells that basically, you know, the mitochondria within the sperm, the whole purpose of that mitochondria is to power the sperm so that it can swim and it can actually penetrate that egg. The mitochondria within the egg is the thing that actually enables the exponential division of cells and, of course, the development of that early embryo. So sometimes when miscarriage occurs, or when, in fact, particularly sometimes when infertility occurs, i.e. the inability to conceive, it's actually not infertility that we're dealing with at all. Fertilization may be occurring, but the development of that embryo through to a positive pregnancy test doesn't happen. And 1 in 4 pregnancies, we know this very clearly, 1 in 4 pregnancies end before a period is due or a woman has had a positive pregnancy test, right? And methylation is a part of that because it impacts all of these other aspects that we need to take into consideration, right? So that is really quite an important part of understanding this whole picture. Not just MTHFR variants, not just how that impacts one area, but how it impacts multiple areas and multiple steps within that biochemistry within the body, right? And so detoxification becomes problematic when we have this variance. Of course, hormonal balance also will be impacted here. You know, all of these things don't happen without proper methylation. So we have to support methylation first and foremost. And B vitamins, of course, will be one way, and methylated B vitamins, of course, will be one way of doing that. But then there's a whole lot of other areas that need to be supported in order for that to occur. From the things that we do in our environmental day-to-day, and the things that we're exposed to the food that we eat, to the obstacles that we remove. You know, I often talk about this whole idea of acting pregnant now to get pregnant later. Really what that means is, think about it. If you're already pregnant right now, what are all of the things that you would do to ensure that you have the healthiest possible baby? Right? And this applies to both prospective partners, by the way, you know, male and female, because what we know is very, very clear in the research. In fact, there was an article that was published in Gynecology and Obstetrics, the Archives of Gynecology and Obstetrics in 2016. And essentially it concluded that both maternal and paternal variations of the MTHFR gene, the C677T, as well as the A1298C, both of those, right, polymorphisms were associated with recurrent pregnancy loss. Remember what I just talked about before, sometimes it's not recurrent pregnancy loss, we just don't know that conception is occurring. We think that it's not, but then often it basically gets to a point where we know we're pregnant and then miscarriage actually occurs. But what's important here to understand, and what's really crucial to get clarity on, is the fact that this is not just to do with one person. It is never to do with one person. Fertility, the ability to conceive, the ability to take a healthy pregnancy to term and take home a healthy baby, is a 50-50 equation. So when I don't see, and this happens very frequently, you know, that men come in, they've barely had a semen analysis done at a proper lab, and they certainly haven't had any of their bloods tested. They would have no idea about their genetic variances and what's going on there. I mean, obviously that's going to be the very first place to start, because I know that if we are not addressing these issues, poor methylation will increase the risk of miscarriage. It will increase the risk of preeclampsia and abnormal embryonic development, and of course increase the risk of birth abnormalities as well, right? And all to do with both prospective parents. It's not just to do with one person, okay? So when we're dealing with reproductive challenges, it's important to take that into consideration first and foremost, that we're not dealing with just one side of the equation, even though that is how almost as a society we are kind of, you know, steered towards. We get the results that we get for our patients because we actually treat both prospective parents, okay? So proper methylation really depends on many factors. It's not just to do with the type of folate that you take. And this is where most people miss the point, as I've said before, right? It's about making sure that we've got all of those interrelated communication pieces in place. You know, so often, in fact, I got this question this week, right? I talked to many people during the week, which is wonderful. And this week I got the heroin addict question, right? And for those of you who have never heard the heroin addict question, it relates to something that's really interesting, which is the field of epigenetics, right? Epigenetics basically relates to that whole idea that I've mentioned earlier about how the gene loads the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. And I used to get really annoyed, like when I first started doing this, like 5 or 10 years in, I used to get really annoyed when people were like, oh, but I don't believe lifestyle will make a difference. I don't believe that a healthy diet or what I'm exposed to or whatever else will decrease my risk of miscarriage or infertility or whatever else. And, now I just realize that it's because people just don't know. There is an ignorance aspect of just like, it's that whole thing of I don't know what I don't know. And so they just simply have not been educated around the fact of how this happens and the amount of science that's out there about how this happens. But, and of course, for you guys, I'm so glad that you're here because you clearly don't fit that mold, right? It's the opposite for you. You really do understand. But the heroin addict question is this: how come my neighbor who drinks, smokes, does drugs, blah, 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 whatever it is, gets pregnant, has a healthy baby, and here I am doing all of the right things and I don't get to do that, or I'm having so many problems. And that's where the science of epigenetics comes in, right? But it's also where, and epigenetics basically is that how does the environment actually trigger the way in which the body is operating and the things that are happening within your own biochemistry. Every person is different. And I find, as much as I find that question fascinating, and I do, I've answered it for 20 years, right? And I find it fascinating, but I also find it a bit of a waste of time. Okay. And I'll tell you why. The reason is that what does it help you, right? To compare yourself having a problem of trying to conceive with someone who is intrinsically so absolutely different to you in every way, right? And what does it really matter if the heroin addict does get pregnant and have a baby? It's not happening for you, right? And as blunt as that may sound, I hope that it kind of like jolts you a little bit to go, actually, you know what? That doesn't matter, because that person's genetic makeup, their SNPs are going to be different to yours. In the same way that we've all heard of people who basically, have never smoked a day in their life and die of lung cancer, right? And then we have that one person who is an absolute chain smoker who never develops lung cancer at all. That is epigenetics at work. Right? One person, their triggers, their environmental factors or triggers will, trigger them to have stomach issues or brain issues or muscle issues or you name it, right? For you, clearly the same trigger is causing infertility or miscarriage or something else, right? And so this is why I find that this just makes sense as to why I actually find that whole conversation can be just really kind of waste of time, because it doesn't actually help you move forward towards what it is that you want. It just kind of keeps you in, and when I had this conversation this week, it was really kind of from a place of, this guy was really annoyed about the fact that, how dare I talk about these things and, say that these things make a difference when the heroin addict syndrome is the thing that's popping up. Right? And the reason is very simple. And when I've just described it now, it kind of makes sense. You go, oh, okay, so that's why. But can you see how, it doesn't help you actually have a baby, right? What needs to happen is understanding how do these things play out in your specific situation and what it is that you need to do about it so that it changes the outcome that you're experiencing right now, okay? That, at the end of the day, is what we want. Because even with an MTHFR genetic variance, you can still take home a healthy baby if we're addressing all of the other foundational aspects of what needs to happen. Like I said before, when we didn't even know about MTHFR and we didn't even know what we could do about it and we didn't even know how to really treat it, we still got results and people still had babies, because we're looking at, an entire foundation and optimization of how the body operates and not just one single factor. Yes, I absolutely will reiterate one more time that ensuring that you have the right building blocks in place, of course that's going to be useful. Of course that's going to be helpful. But again, my big idea number 3 is that it really does not make sense to really only just focus on that one thing. And I see practitioners doing this all the time. It's kind of like, it's almost like, for when you have a hammer, the only tool, or when you have a nail, the only tool is a hammer. And I think that, we need to become really versatile and really flexible in looking at every possible single thing and addressing all of these minor factors, because what we know, and again, this comes from epidemiological research from populations around the globe, right? A couple at peak fertility has an average of 3 months time to pregnancy. Literally, it's have sex, get pregnant, have a baby, done. We're no longer having this conversation. When we're still having this conversation, right, we then need to start asking, okay, why is this happening? Because ultimately, the reason as to why it's happening lies within the possible obstacles to optimum fertility. And what we know is that an obstacle to optimum fertility can be anything. It can be irregular cycle, it can be PCOS, it can be MTHFR, it can be, you name it. Pick one of those things. That's an obstacle to optimum fertility. All of a sudden, we go from an average of 3 months time to pregnancy to an average of 2 years. So you can see there's a huge compounding effect. And again, this is not my data. This is epidemiological data of populations around the globe, right? But this is essentially what we know. One minor factor takes us 3 months to 2 years. A second minor factor takes us from an average of 2 to 7 years. And a third gives us an average time of pregnancy or to pregnancy of 40 years. No one has 40 years to get pregnant. Right. And often when we assess a couple's situation, it's not abnormal, right, for us to see 50 plus minor factors at play. Right. As far as I'm concerned, that's the job. It's to figure out what are all of the pieces of this puzzle and what do we need to do about it. The problem is that most people don't address things that way, and most couples don't really know to. Right. And so they go to a practitioner who will look at a half a dozen things and kind of say everything looks normal, just keep trying. And they will do that for years. And then they'll kind of get enough of that, and they will go over here and they'll try something else for a little while. And then they'll kind of have enough of that. And so they kind of keep jumping from place to place or thing to thing without really fully looking at, okay, what are all of the things? What I want to know when I treat a patient, in fact, one of the things that we do is we take couples through a very comprehensive fertility assessment before we even, invite them to understand more about the program. Because I want to understand first and foremost, first of all, is there work to be done? Because if there isn't any work to be done, like we're not the clinic that treats people who have been trying for 5 minutes and nothing has worked. We work with couples who have a documented serious issue. They've tried lots of different things. Nothing has worked. We really focus on difficult and complex cases, right? And so what happens is I want to ascertain that first. Is there work to be done? If so, is that work that we can do? Because if it's not, again, like my purpose is not to waste people's time, keeping them going around. Like I always like to show this diagram, keeping them going around in circles, right? Of course, it would be lovely if we had a way of going from here in a direct line to what it is that we want to achieve. Not possible. Or at least I haven't figured that out yet. Maybe that's my limitation, the what I don't know, what I don't know. But I have to say, I tweak, I try, and still have not found a way to make that a direct line. I think there's something to be said about how life doesn't go in direct lines, how nothing in nature is actually a straight line. But anyway, that's a whole nother philosophical discussion, physical, physics and philosophical at the same time. But, so when we come back and we bring that back to MTHFR, when we bring that back to what it is that needs to happen in terms of helping couples really overcome that challenge, we need to not become so narrow-minded. Okay, and that's big idea number 3, is that we have to open this up and understand that for everything we know that could impact a couple's ability or an individual's ability, by the way, because we support a lot of people going through solo reproduction as well. So for everything that we know can be a problem, there are a multitude of things that we haven't even uncovered yet. Okay, so understanding that there is work to be done there is a great start, and then starting to kind of pull away, but also knowing that, even in terms of methylation, even in terms of how the body operates regarding fertility and genetics, there are many other SNPs that will impact. It's not just MTHFR. If you go and you Google MTR or MTRR, BHMT, MTHFD1, you know, like these are all different types of SNPs that will have a similar impact on the outcome that we're looking for. So again, is when I say, you know, MTHFR, great. It's one thing and it's an important area, but there are many other SNPs that will also play a role here. And that is going to be absolutely key to get clarity on, okay? So let's go through, let's see questions. I saw that there were a couple of questions here on Facebook. So I'm going to go and answer any of those questions, and also let me know if there's anything else that you want to know at this point, because ultimately, here's the three takeaways that I really want to make sure that you're clear about. It is not just about MTHFR, right? Testing the whole spectrum of genetic variants is going to be important. Understanding more about how those things correlate. And in fact, I would highly recommend, if you haven't listened to my diagnostics for infertility and miscarriage talk, which is also on the Gabriela Rosa Fertility page, go ahead and listen to that, because you will understand how many more kind of steps need to be taken. They're often, and the 5 steps, you know, the 5 kind of steps in order to not only know that you've tested all the things that you needed to test, but that you're actually following through a process that's going to end up with a different result at the end of that. There's a really specific kind of little method that I've been able to kind of outline in that talk that I think will be really helpful. So definitely check that out, because it will certainly be of assistance. Yeah, look at this. I had my 9th miscarriage last July and told the tests are okay to get pregnant in a month, which I don't think I miscarried my 8-week heartbeat. Yeah. What such a sad story. You know, Yasmin basically telling us that, you know, she's had 9 miscarriages and she got pregnant again, and keeps being told that, you know, the tests are back and everything is fine. The one thing that I will say in terms of that, and I've done a talk as well on miscarriages specifically. So again, all in the Gabriela Rosa Fertility page. So go through, there's a catalogue actually that we've put up as well. So you can actually see all of the different topics that I've covered so far, and I'll continue covering. There's a whole lot more topics that I'm covering in November actually that are going to be quite interesting for those of you who are trying to conceive without success. But this is something that we see very frequently. You know, it's people go ahead, they do some testing, they basically are told everything is fine, and keep trying, right? And hence bring in my little picture of going around in circles, right? And what we know is that it's not fine. It's not fine until we're holding that healthy baby, right? It's not fine until we actually have the outcome that we're looking for. Nobody's, you know, idea of fun is to be permanently and persistently and consistently pregnant without having a baby. Right? I mean, 9 miscarriages is a lot of miscarriages, a lot of being pregnant without having a baby. And I really do feel for you, Yasmin, because it is really just, you know, it's not a fun place to be. It's certainly not a good place to be. And understanding more is certainly going to help. But this is also where we need to take responsibility, take charge, and go, okay, this is not okay. You know, it's not okay. Like in my view, in my mind, to myself and my patients, that is just not even a conversation that I would want to be having, that everything is fine, just keep trying. No, I want to know, until we're holding that baby, what else? How else? You know, who else? What else do we need to actually do? What else do we need to understand? What else do we need to actually clarify so that we get answers, right? So that we get to the bottom of what it is that could be getting in the way here and start to address those things. That is how I see that we get results where everything else hasn't worked, right? So fibroids I'm going to actually cover in a full conversation, a full topic. So I'm not going to get into that right now because we're pretty much on time in terms of this topic. So I want to make sure that you guys, you know, are really clear about anything to do with this that you want to know. And I'll also say, by the way, we've got the next fertility challenge coming up, right? For those of you who don't know what the Fertility Challenge is, it's a free event. It runs over a 12-day period where literally myself and my entire team are in there guiding you. So there are education pieces and tasks that we challenge you to do in order to overcome the Fertility Challenge, and not only that, I mean, really, we want you to conquer it. We want you to conquer the Fertility Challenge, and we want you to just like go in there and, start. Most people, they come in, they have no idea what to expect. They go through 12 days, and by the end, they're like, oh my God, my eyes have been opened to all of the things, or many more of the things that I can do in order to not only optimize my chances of taking home a healthy baby, but actually understanding what it is that I can do now to change my circumstances, irrespective of what hasn't worked in the past. That's really what we want to do, right? And that is what we do in the Fertility Challenge. So you can go ahead, you can Google Fertility Challenge, Gabriela Rosa's Fertility Challenge. You will find a place to register, or you can just go to the website or the link to register, which is https:// in fact, if you just Google, like on your browser, if you just put in fertilitychallenge.online/register, fertilitychallenge.online/register, you will be able to find that. And so grateful for Gabriela as I'm holding my toddler. Thanks for the program and support. Kate, love you, my darling. So grateful for you being in my life as well. So thank you. So yeah, ultimately, Fertility Challenge is the next step. In fact, it starts next week. We kick off on the 30th of October. Get in it. You will learn lots. We have almost over 5,000 people participating in this round. Every single round, we have between 5,000 to 10,000 people. So already we have over 5,000 people. You are definitely not going to be alone. It's going to be a fantastic educational event. So go ahead and register for that. Come and participate. The other thing that I will say, book officially launches next week. So exciting. So that's Fertility Breakthrough, Overcoming Infertility and Miscarriage when other treatments have failed. This is a labor of love, last 20 years of research and understanding of what it is that we do on paper for you to benefit from. So I would highly recommend, and this is one of our gorgeous little bubbas, I would highly recommend that you check this out. The pre-order is actually up right now. So if you wanted to pre-order your signed copy, I'll be personally signing it for you with whatever message you want. thefertile.me/book pre-order, all one word, thefertile.me/book pre-order. So that is essentially kind of brings me to the end of this particular conversation. But, the main thing about, and is MTHFR, there's a good question here, MTHFR linked to KTC clotting time gene? Look, absolutely, because what we also know is that when we are dealing with MTHFR and methylation problems, that, we have to question thrombophilias, we have to question clotting in general, we have to question all of these things. So there is definitely a link. And this is why I often say, we want to make sure that we're not just focusing on one thing. We want to be as open in addressing as many of those minor factors as possible, because in doing so, we are able to reach many more of those obstacles that essentially we need to change the circumstances that we're currently dealing with in terms of not being able to take home a healthy pregnancy and a healthy baby, right? So that, I hope, helps. And join me. Make sure you join me on the next Fertility Challenge. I'm going to be there for the whole 12 days, really guiding you guys, cheering you on, and I can't wait. And next week, we already have our next topic actually in place, and I don't even know yet what it is. So let me find out, and I'll tell you guys what it is. Let's see. So next week, we're actually talking about, drum roll, oh, I'm explaining AMH levels. Look at that. So AMH levels explained, and I'm going to be talking a whole lot more about egg quality, how that impacts, and what it is that needs to happen when your AMH levels are low, what it is that you need to do if you need to improve egg quality. All of those things we're going to be discussing in next week's talk, which will be incidentally one day after the Fertility Challenge actually starts. So make sure you join me for both. I hope that helps. Good to see you guys. And until next time, bye for now.